Ryan was a 22-year-old from Minnesota who always fancied himself as a bit of an explorer. Nothing made him happier than when he had the chance to stay the night in an abandoned building or an abandoned mine. He claimed it was a mix of the excitement from hanging out someplace that you technically weren't supposed to be inside of, and the adrenaline from the part of you in the back of your mind that's always telling you that something is hiding in the dark. After spending the summer enjoying himself with friends and family, Ryan had decided to do something for himself before he ultimately had to return back to his life at college. And it just so happened that he had recently found out about an old abandoned farm and farmhouse that was only about a 3-hour drive from his home. After asking a few of his friends to see if anyone wanted to join him, all of them ended up saying no. It's not that they didn't want to spend time with their friend, but none of them were too keen on driving 3 hours to spend the night trespassing in a supposedly abandoned building. This didn't deter Ryan from going on the adventure, however. That being said, the weekend before he was due back at college, Ryan packed up his backpack with his typical gear, which included flashlights, batteries, multiple bottles of water, a sleeping bag, and an external power supply to charge his phone in case it died and he needed to get a hold of anyone. And once it was all in his bag, he threw it into his van and he got ready to hit the road. Ryan wasn't sure what he could expect once he arrived to the farmhouse, but from what he had been told, he knew that he would have to park at the end of a small dirt road and then hike for about half a mile up the path, and then he would reach the barn. Sure enough, once his navigation system told him that he had reached his destination, Ryan spotted the trail and quickly found a safe place to park his van for the evening. By the time Ryan was making his way up the dirt path, it was getting to be about 1 in the afternoon, which was a bit later than he had wanted to get started, but he was happy to be there nonetheless. As Ryan began to walk down the small dirt path, he quickly realized why he needed to park down at the end of the road. The path may have been drivable at one point in time, but at the time that Ryan was there, it was far too overgrown, with some parts of the path seeming to have sunk into the ground from rainfall and natural erosion. After walking on the path for about 5 minutes, Ryan figured that he must have been getting close to the farmhouse when all of a sudden he saw something that surprised him more than he expected it to. There was another person on the path with him. Up ahead from Ryan, he could see someone walking down the path toward him. This was weird because Ryan rarely saw other people when he was out on these excursions, so he wasn't sure how he should react to this situation, especially considering that he was fairly sure that he was trespassing at this point, and he didn't know whether or not this was the owner of the property. As the person got closer, Ryan saw that the person was actually a man who appeared to be about 10 or 15 years older than he was. The man was wearing a black tank top with dirty jeans that had massive holes at both kneecaps. To Ryan's surprise, he just passed right by him without saying a single word. Ryan continued walking down the path and eventually just shrugged off the encounter. He just assumed that the person was either out exploring, just like he was, or perhaps he was just out for a walk on the trails. After he didn't get in trouble, he just figured it was no big deal and continued on down the dirt road. After a few more minutes of walking, the dirt path opened up into a large fenced-off field, and about 20 yards on the other side of the fence, Ryan could see the abandoned farmhouse. He could feel the excitement building up, so without any hesitation, he began walking through the fence and up to the abandoned buildings. The first building that Ryan came up to was the abandoned farmhouse, and as he got closer to it, he could begin to see an even larger abandoned building that was located directly behind it. It was a large two-story barn that had clearly deteriorated over the years without anyone taking care of it. Ryan decided to walk right past the farmhouse and up to the giant abandoned barn, and as he approached what he assumed was the front door which would lead into the lower section of the barn, he noticed right away that there was a large padlock hanging from the center of the large double barn doors. Now, Ryan had no problem trespassing in abandoned places, but he found something morally wrong with breaking into a place that had a lock on it. This, of course, restricted the amount of places that he could explore, but it was also his own little moral code that he liked to stick to. After realizing that the barn was locked, he decided that he would just stick to the farmhouse. This upset Ryan a little bit, but considering the massive size of the farmhouse, he figured he would be able to kill more than enough time exploring that building alone. Ryan turned back to the farmhouse and made his way back to the front of the building. He paused for a second after making his way back out from the back of the house. He wasn't sure what it was, but he could have sworn that he saw movement coming from the tree line near the trail. He waited for a moment before calling out to ask if anyone was there, and when there was no response, Ryan just decided to shrug it off as if it was an animal, or possibly even his eyes playing tricks on him. He continued to make his way to the front of the porch of the giant abandoned home. Ryan held his breath as he reached for the doorknob, just hoping that it would open. He let out a sigh of relief as he felt the handle turn and the heavy wooden door swung open into the home. Ryan poked his head in for a quick look around before taking his first steps through the threshold. The floorboards began to creak under the pressure of his feet, and the sound made him hesitate momentarily and wonder how safe the floor of the house was. But after a moment, he decided it was worth the risk and made his way deeper into the home, making sure to close the door behind him. Ryan was amazed. Aside from being a bit dusty and trashed from other people coming in, the interior of the building was amazing. As soon as he walked through the door, he was greeted with a large room to his right and a large room to his left, and then in front of him was a staircase that led to the second floor, right next to a hallway that led into what Ryan would assume was the dining room. Across from the dining room sat a small kitchen that was missing its appliances. Both the fridge and the stove seemed to have been torn from the wall. The first hour or so spent inside the home, Ryan simply walked around from room to room, figuring out where the best spot to spend his night would be. He ultimately settled on a small room that was one of 3 that were located on the second floor. He liked this room because it gave him a good view of the trail in case anyone were to walk up it, and there was something about it that just made him feel comfortable. After setting up his sleeping bag and making sure his room for the night was set up just right, Ryan decided to go for a small walk around the property to see what else he might find. After a couple of hours spent outside, the sun was starting to go down, so Ryan decided to head back to the farmhouse and get ready to have some dinner. He walked back inside and immediately felt like something was off. He stopped himself at the bottom of the stairs, and before walking up to the room, he decided to call out to see if anyone else had wandered into the house with him while he was out exploring. He was relieved when he didn't get a response, and decided that no matter what, he was going to have to go upstairs, so he might as well get started. Ryan slowly crept up the stairs, keeping his fingers crossed that he wouldn't run into anyone or anything. After successfully making it onto the second floor, he walked over to the bedroom that he had chosen to stay in and went inside. The first thing he looked for was any sign that someone or something had been in there, but when he saw that his sleeping bag hadn't been touched and his backpack was still in the corner, he determined that nothing had happened and decided to sit down and try to relax. He was ashamed to admit it, but from time to time things like this would happen. He would put a thought into his head that would cause him to be genuinely scared even though he had no real reason to be concerned. However, as he sat there on the floor wondering if he was going to make it through the evening, one of his worst fears came true. Chills began to roll down Ryan's spine as he heard the unmistakable sound of the floorboards on the first floor creaking in the doorway of the farmhouse. Someone had entered the abandoned farmhouse, and Ryan didn't think that it was another explorer like him, considering the fact that it was already dark out at this point. Ryan was having a hard time catching his breath as he heard the sound of footsteps down below him. He tried his best to calm himself down, but that got even more difficult when the sounds from the first floor turned from the sound of walking to the sound of throwing objects and slamming things. It almost sounded like the person was looking for something. Ryan realized that the person was most likely looking for him. He immediately remembered back to earlier in that day when he thought he saw something in the tree line. He was now convinced that he did see something, and that something was actually whoever was downstairs. Ryan continued to think of what he could do to get himself out of the situation, and that was when he noticed that the window that he was next to didn't appear to have a screen. He thought for a moment, and figured that he was most likely only about 10-12 feet off the ground at most, and that he could probably jump for it if he had to. And without a moment to consider any more options, Ryan's decision was made for him as he heard the sound of footsteps begin to walk up the stairs. He quickly and quietly grabbed his backpack and as quickly as he could, opened the window. He didn't have time to pack up his sleeping bag or any of the food that he was getting ready to cook. Ryan's time was up. He could hear whoever it was in the house with him had finally made it up the stairs and had begun throwing things around in the room next to his. Ryan had gotten the window open, and as he put his left leg out the window, he was frozen in fear when he heard a voice coming from behind him.
There you are.
Ryan quickly looked over his shoulder and could see a man leaning out the window of the room next to his. Right away, he could tell that it was the same guy that he had seen walking down the trail earlier that day. The man pulled himself into the window, and Ryan could hear him running through the other room and into the hallway to get to the room that Ryan was in. He couldn't take his time getting out the window. Ryan practically fell right out of it. He hit the ground hard, but his adrenaline was pumping, so without taking a second to recover, he had sprung back to his feet and began running for the fence. He could hear the man yelling from the window above him that Ryan had nowhere to go, but all he kept telling himself was, "I just gotta make it back to my van." Ryan kept running as fast as he could through the farm and toward the fence, just hoping that he wasn't being followed. But just as he was making his way across the fence line, he heard the sound of the man throwing the front door open and running down the porch steps after Ryan. Ryan continued to run as fast as he could, doing his best not to fall on the uneven dirt path. He wasn't sure whether or not it was his mind playing tricks on him, but he could swear that he heard the sound of footsteps behind him getting closer and closer. However, after what felt like forever of running, Ryan could see his van. He hit the unlock button on his keys as he pulled them from his pocket and threw himself into the driver's seat. Without looking to see if he was still being followed, Ryan tossed his van into drive and took off. Right after pulling out of the spot that he had parked in, he could tell that things were only getting worse as his van appeared to now have a flat tire. Ryan knew that he had to keep going, though, and decided to continue driving despite the fact that it was going to destroy the tire and the rim. That didn't matter to him at the moment. All that mattered was getting out of there. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and called the police as he made his way down the road as far as he could before being told by 911 to stay and wait where he was. Ryan explained the situation to the officer on the scene, and even though he was worried that he was about to get in trouble for trespassing, he told him every detail. The officer took down the report, waited with Ryan until a tow company would come and help him, and then told Ryan that he would go to the farm and take a look around. Ryan never found out whether or not the police found the man or what was going on that night, but he was a lot more wary about where he chose to go exploring next.